The frost cracked under her boots like tiny bones. Each step towards the stable was a weight, heavier than the feed bucket swinging uselessly at her side. It wasn't the cold January air that stole her breath. It was the silence, not the quiet, of peace, but the thick, suffocating quiet of an absence carved too deep. The smell of hay, usually comforting, now tasted like dust and old sorrow. Wind whistled through a loose board, a mournful sigh in the cavernous space where only one stall door stood open. What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind, especially one you never wanted? Evelyn didn't look at the empty stall on the left, David's stall, her brother's pride. Instead, her gaze, heavy and reluctant, dragged towards the open door at the end. From the gloom within, a single large dark eye watched her, unblinking, waiting. She hadn't touched him since the funeral. 3 weeks. Her grief was a raw, feral thing, coiled tight in her chest. Coming here felt like a betrayal. This pony, this Shetland, was David's last impulsive project. A rescue case, he'd called him, found neglected, barely able to stand. "Thistle," David had declared, laughing, "because he's prickly but tougher than he looks." Evelyn hadn't seen the toughness, then just another burden David cheerfully shouldered that she couldn't fathom. Now David was gone. A sudden, stupid accident on an icy road, and Thistle was hers, a living, breathing monument to the gaping hole where her brother used to be. She forced her legs to move, the feed bucket a flimsy shield. The straw rustled under her hesitant steps. Thistle didn't move. He stood in the center of his stall, a compact silhouette against the weak morning light filtering through the high window. Not lying down, not pacing, just standing. There was an unnerving stillness about him. Not calm. Alert, yes. His ears pricked forward, tracking her every shift. But beneath the alertness, a tremor ran through his sturdy frame. A fine, constant vibration like a tuning fork struck and left to hum. It wasn't fear of her. It seemed deeper, rooted. She stopped outside the stall door. The air between them crackled with unspoken things. His dark coat, thick and shaggy for winter, looked dull. Dust motes danced in the sliver of light, catching the worry in his deep brown eye. He was small, barely reaching her waist, yet his presence filled the space, charged with an ancient wariness. Evelyn remembered David's voice, warm and teasing. "He's got the heart of a Clydesdale crammed into a Shetland body, Ev. You'll see." All she saw now was a creature impossibly linked to her pain, standing impossibly still except for that constant, unsettling tremor. Her hand, ungloved, felt frozen on the latch. She should just dump the feed over the door and leave. That's what she'd done for weeks. Minimal contact. Necessary evil. But today, the silence pressed harder. The wind's moan sounded too much like a sob. She fumbled the latch open, the metallic clang unnaturally loud. Thistle flinched, a sharp jerk of his head, his whole body tensing. The tremor intensified for a second. A soft puff of breath clouded the cold air before his nostrils. She stepped inside, the stall suddenly, feeling smaller, more intimate. The smell of horse, straw, and something else, a faint medicinal tang, filled her nose. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the worn wooden floorboards, avoiding the direct gaze she could feel burning into her. She tipped the bucket, the grain rattling into the feeder. The sound usually brought David's horses crowding eagerly. Thistle didn't move. He watched the grain fall, his ears flicking back and forth, but his hooves remained planted, rooted to that one spot in the center. Why wouldn't he eat? Why just stand? The question pricked at her, unwanted. She started to back out, eager for the escape of the silent aisle. As she turned, her boot scuffed a loose piece of wood near the wall. A small carved figure tumbled out from the shadows. A little wooden horse, rough-hewn, one of David's whittling attempts, abandoned. Months ago, a gasp tore from her throat, sharp and painful. The sight of it, David's clumsy handiwork, lying in the straw like a discarded piece of him. It was too much. The carefully constructed dam inside her cracked. A single hot tear escaped, tracing a burning path down her cold cheek. She squeezed, her eyes shut, turning her face away, ashamed of the weakness, furious at the stupid wooden toy, furious at the world. A soft sound, not the wind, not the settling barn, close. She opened her eyes, blurred with tears. Thistle had moved, not towards the food, towards her. He stood less than an arm's length away, his head lowered slightly. That deep brown eye, so wary before, held hers. Not demanding, not fearful, just present, watching the tear track its path. The constant tremor in his legs was still there, a low thrum she could almost feel in the floorboards, but his gaze was steady, intense. He took one more hesitant step forward, his muzzle almost level with her hip. He didn't touch her. He didn't nudge. He simply stood there, close. His breath, warm and grassy, fogged the air near her frozen hand. He sniffed, once softly, the sound impossibly loud in the charged silence. Not at the grain, at the sleeve of her coat, damp with the tear she'd wiped away. Her breath hitched. The raw ache in her chest didn't lessen, but for a moment, the crushing loneliness shifted. It wasn't replaced by warmth. Not yet. But by something else. A shared space. A quiet acknowledgement of the pain hanging thick in the air. He wasn't demanding comfort. He wasn't offering easy solace. He was just there, standing his ground, trembling, yet holding space beside her breaking point. She didn't reach out. Her hand stayed clenched at her side, but she didn't move away either. They stood like that, human and horse, bound by grief and a legacy neither had chosen in the cold, quiet stable. The wind still sighed. The frost still held the world tight. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the soft rhythm of his breathing, the low hum of his trembling legs, and the unspoken question hanging between them. Why did he stand so still? Why, when the grain was there, warm and inviting, did he choose to stand rooted, in the center of the stall, trembling, yet somehow anchored? She finally turned to go, the wooden horse forgotten in the straw. Her steps felt leaden, the path back to the empty farmhouse stretching impossibly long. She didn't look back, not until she reached the stable door. Compelled by a force she didn't understand, she glanced over her shoulder. Thistle wasn't at his feeder. He stood at the open stall door, his small, sturdy frame framed by the dark wood. He was watching her leave. His head was up, ears pricked forward, that deep brown gaze fixed on her retreating figure. The tremor was still there, a visible vibration, in his short legs. But he stood at the threshold, a tiny sentinel in the gloom. He didn't call out. He didn't take a step beyond the stall. He just watched. And as she pulled the heavy barn door shut, blocking out the sight of him, the last thing she saw was that unwavering, watchful eye, holding hers until the latch clicked home. She leaned her forehead against the cold wood, the image seared into her mind. Why did he stand like that? And why, when she walked away, did the echo of his presence feel less like a chain and more like a thread? The shared silence in the stable didn't erase the weight Evelyn carried, but it shifted it. Thistle remained her daily obligation, a small, trembling monument to David. She'd feed him, muck the stall, her movements mechanical, her gaze often skittering away from his watchful eye. Yet the memory of his quiet presence during her tearful moment lingered, a fragile thread in the gloom. Weeks bled into a raw, wet February. The tremor in Thistle's legs persisted, that constant low hum beneath his shaggy coat. But stranger things began to weave themselves into the routine. Evelyn would murmur David's name while checking hay stores, and Thistle's ears would snap forward, swiveling towards the sound with an intensity he never showed for his own name or the rattle of grain. Once, she absent-mindedly whistled a fragment of a tune David used to hum while mending fences. A silly, off-key melody. Thistle, usually rooted in his spot, took 2 stiff, trembling steps towards the stall door, nostrils flaring, a soft, questioning nicker escaping him before. He seemed to catch himself and stilled, trembling harder. It unsettled her. It felt like trespassing, like the pony was tuned to a frequency only David had broadcast. She found herself talking less, moving quieter, afraid to trigger these echoes. She'd catch Thistle staring not at her, but through her towards the empty stall David's horse had occupied, his dark eyes holding a depth of something that looked unsettlingly like waiting. The rational part of her dismissed it. Coincidence, anthropomorphism, the desperate need of a grieving mind to find meaning. But the quiet, watchful tension in the stable grew thicker than the winter mud. The breaking point came disguised as spring cleaning. March arrived with tentative warmth, and Evelyn forced herself into David's old tack room, a space she'd avoided since the accident. Dust motes danced in sunbeams, slicing through a grimy window, illuminating cobwebs draped over bridles and the ghostly shapes of blankets folded on shelves. The smell of leather oil and hay was overpoweringly David. She moved quickly, ruthlessly, stacking old saddle pads, her jaw clenched against the memories each item evoked. Then her hand brushed against something wedged behind a stack of dusty horse and hound magazines on a high shelf. Not leather, wood, rough unfinished wood. Her breath hitched. She pulled it down. Another of David's whittling attempts. But this wasn't a discarded toy horse like the one Thistle had uncovered. This was a small, crude plaque. On it, painstakingly, carved with David's characteristic clumsy determination, were 2 words. Thistle's courage. Below the words, the date, just 3 days before David died. The dam didn't crack this time. It exploded. The plaque fell from her numb fingers, clattering on the concrete floor. A sob ripped from her throat, raw and guttural. All the held-back grief, the anger at the unfairness, the crushing loneliness surged forward in a tidal wave. She crumpled, sliding down the tack room wall, the dusty floor gritty under her palms. Tears, hot and relentless, streamed down her face. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly, lost in the brutal, unvarnished truth of her brother's absence. He'd named this pony's spirit before the accident. He'd seen something in the trembling little creature she'd been too buried in her own resentment to see. And now, he was gone. And all she had was this echo, this living, breathing reminder, standing perpetually still in a stall down the aisle. Her cries weren't silent. They echoed in the small room, ragged breaths tearing at her throat. She was utterly broken, adrift in the sea of her grief, the plaque lying accusingly at her feet. A soft shuffle at the tack room door. Then a quiet puff of breath. Evelyn. Lost. In her storm, didn't hear it at first. Then a presence. Solid. Warm. Close. She looked up, her vision blurred. Thistle stood in the doorway. He hadn't pushed the door fully open. He'd nudged it just enough to fit his compact body through. He stood there, framed by the light from the stable aisle, his sturdy legs trembling with their constant rhythm. But his head was low, his dark eyes fixed on her, holding her shattered gaze without flinching. He didn't approach aggressively. He didn't whinny or stomp. He simply stood, anchored in the doorway, a silent, tremulous pillar. Slowly, deliberately, he took one step into the room, then another. The trembling in his legs seemed to vibrate the dusty air. He stopped less than a foot from where she sat, huddled on the floor. He lowered his head further, his muzzle almost level with her shoulder. He didn't nuzzle. He didn't demand. He exhaled, a long, slow, warm breath that stirred the hair near her temple. It smelled of hay and grass and a simple, earthy life. Then, with infinite gentleness, he rested the broad, velvety plane of his muzzle against her upper arm, just resting it there. A solid, warm, living weight. A silent pressure saying, "I am here. I am staying." Evelyn froze. The sobs choked in her throat. The raw agony didn't vanish, but it was met by this small, trembling creature who had witnessed her fracture and chosen not to flee, but to stand beside it. She leaned her head, ever so slightly, against the solid warmth of his neck. His coarse mane tickled her forehead. She felt the deep thrum of his tremor, a vibration that seemed to resonate with the aftershocks of her own crying. He didn't move. He held his ground, his breath warm and steady against her arm, a quiet bulwark against the storm. Minutes stretched, marked only by her slowing breaths, his warm exhalations, and the constant grounding hum beneath his skin. He stayed until the last shuddering breath left her body, until the silence in the tack room was no longer filled with anguish, but with a shared, exhausted calm. Summer arrived, painting the fields in greens and golds. The stable air, thick with dust motes dancing in sunbeams, smelled of warm hay and horses, not winter's chill and grief. Evelyn moved through her chores with a quiet rhythm that hadn't been there before. The weight remained, but it was a weight she carried now, not one that crushed her. Thistle still stood. He still trembled. The tremor, the vet had finally confirmed after months of Evelyn's careful observation and hesitant questions, was permanent. Nerve damage, likely from some long-ago trauma before David found him. He wasn't in pain, the vet assured her. It was just how he was wired now. But he stood differently. He stood with her. He met her at the stall door now, ears pricked, a soft nicker greeting her arrival. He'd follow her along the fence line. As she checked pastures, his small, sturdy frame pacing hers, the tremor a constant companion but no longer an anchor to one spot. He'd even started venturing cautiously into David's old, empty stall when she mucked it, sniffing the corners with a quiet curiosity, as if finally letting go of the vigil he'd kept. One warm July evening, chores finished, Evelyn lingered in the stable aisle. Thistle stood in his open stall doorway, enjoying the breeze carrying the scent of clover from the fields. The setting sun painted stripes of gold across the worn floorboards. Evelyn leaned against the post opposite him, a sense of quiet peace settling over her, deeper than she'd known since David left. Thistle shifted. He turned his head, not towards her, but towards the far corner of his stall, near where the little wooden horse had lain months before. He took a few stiff, trembling steps into the stall, stopped, and looked back at her. Then he deliberately nudged his nose against a loose floorboard near the wall, the same one her boot had scuffed that cold January day. Curiosity, sharp and sudden, pricked her. She walked into the stall, knelt beside the board Thistle had indicated. His warm breath stirred her hair as he stood close, watching. She pried the board up, not much space underneath, just packed earth and dust, but nestled there, half buried, was something small and faded, not wood this time. Paper. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled it out. An old, creased photograph. David, younger, grinning wildly, his arms slung around the neck of a sturdy, bright-eyed bay gelding, his first horse Ranger gone years ago. And tucked into the corner of the photo, held in place by a rusty paperclip, was a tiny, pressed, purple flower, a thistle bloom. Evelyn stared. David had never been one for sentimentality, but here it was, hidden away. His first horse, his last horse. The tough, resilient flower that shared its name with the trembling pony now standing sentinel beside her. A symbol of endurance, of surviving harsh ground, of blooming despite the prickles. He'd seen it. He'd named Thistle for that spirit, not the weakness, and he'd tucked this tiny relic away, perhaps as a reminder, perhaps as a hope. She looked up at Thistle. He lowered his head, sniffing the photograph gently, his whiskers brushing the faded image of David and Ranger. Then he lifted his gaze back to hers. His dark eyes held no grand revelation, no mystical connection. Just a quiet, deep understanding, reflected in the warm twilight of the stall. The tremor ran through him, a constant vibration, yet he stood firm. He wasn't David's echo anymore. He was Thistle, damaged, trembling, unbreakably brave. And he had been waiting, not just for David, but for her to see it too. The final piece of grief didn't vanish. It transformed. It settled into the hollow spaces, not as a crushing weight, but as a bittersweet warmth, like the late summer sun on her skin. She hadn't just inherited a horse. She'd inherited a testament to the resilience her brother saw in the world, embodied in this small, trembling creature who had patiently stood his ground until she was ready to stand beside him. Evelyn touched the pressed thistle bloom, its delicate purple still vibrant against the faded paper. She traced the curve of David's young, grinning face. Then she rested her forehead gently against Thistle's neck, feeling the familiar tremor, the steady beat of his heart beneath the thick coat. It wasn't the heartbeat she'd lost. It was a different rhythm, a new kind of anchor. She finally understood. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was the hum of a spirit too brave to quit, vibrating against the confines of damaged nerves. He'd carried David's hope. Now, in his own small, steadfast way, he carried a piece of her forward. Sometimes the ones who carry you through the darkest fields are the ones who stand trembling but refuse to fall. If this story of Thistle's quiet courage and Evelyn's healing touched something in your heart, do us a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss our next journey into the raw, beautiful moments that stitch us back together. Let us know in the comments what moved you most. Your stories fuel ours. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even the smallest steps, taken bravely, can lead us home. See you tomorrow, right here, for the next story that might just change everything.